President of the United Nations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm part of both the presenting organization, Coalition for Peace Action and United Nations of Greater Philadelphia. I will share the links if anybody is new and want to know a little bit more about us in the chat later on. The twin threats of climate and nuclear crisis are on everyone's mind. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion with really good panel of speakers. I also want to thank all our co-sponsors, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Nuclear Ban US, the Welcoming Center, Campaign for Peace and Disarmament and Common Security, and Physicians for Social Responsibility. A big thank you to all of you. I'm going to ask Ed Aguilar from Coalition for Peace Action to take it forward.
Okay, thank you, Manisha. Thank you very much. We still have people coming in, but in the interest of time, we're going to be going ahead. So let me just fix my screen a bit here. And we have some wonderful speakers, as you know, that's why you're here. So welcome to everyone. And thank you for joining us on what is a stormy day in many parts of the country. So we have the first speaker that we're going to have. We'll just get right to Timon Wallace. Timon Wallace is the current executive director. Some of you may have seen an error on the screen that he was a past director. No, but he's a current executive director of nuclearban.usa. Timon holds a PhD in peace studies from Bradford University. He has served as executive director of Nonviolent Peace Force, directing peace building projects around the world. He served as director of the National Peace Council in his native United Kingdom. He's been International Secretary of Peace Brigades International. His book, Disarming the Nuclear Argument, The Truth About Nuclear Weapons, analyzes the cost, accident, risk, and legality of nuclear weapons. And finally, his other book, which was a great inspiration to us at No Wars, No Warming, is called Warheads to Windmills, which is really kind of the theme of what we're doing today. So welcome to Timon Wallace, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen to show you a few slides about the Warheads to Windmills report and the campaign that goes along with it. Why is that? Okay, I'm getting all kinds of other things on my screen. Can you see?
Yes, we see your presentation.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to run quickly through some of the main points of our report. Ed mentioned the Warheads to Windmills report that we published in 2018 or 19, and we've just republished an updated version for 2023, and the full version of it is coming out shortly. This is from the summary. But as you all know, we have two existential threats facing humanity right now: the climate crisis. We've had some major developments in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill and so on. But despite a slight drop in carbon emissions in 2020 because of the pandemic, where globally the climate is still getting worse and worse every day, and the carbon emissions are increasing every day, and that is the very worrying sign. We don't know what that will lead to, but we're on target for actually massive increases in temperature in the coming decades if we don't do a major turnaround. And although there are projections that the Biden administration's policies will cut back on this, as I said, this is about the global crisis and not just the US. And we are currently on target to reach these enormously large numbers in the pink at the top there. And what we need to be doing is drastic reductions like these show here. So that's where we are with climate. We're not on target. There's been a lot of very stark warnings from the UN Secretary General and others. And the same situation, as you all know, I'm sure on this call, with nuclear weapons. This was 3 years ago when the doomsday clock was unveiled to be at 100 seconds to midnight. As you probably all know, it's now been moved forward to 90 seconds, and for a number of reasons. But this is a growing danger of nuclear war that's been rising since the 1991. At the bottom of this chart, I don't know if you can see the actual words, but I mean, when the Cold War ended, they moved the doomsday clock back to 17 minutes to midnight, and it's been creeping forward pretty steadily ever since then. And most recently, since 2020, because of Ukraine, because of the collapse of a number of treaties, and because of the growing tensions, not just between the US and Russia, but also US and China, which I'm sure Joseph Gerson is going to talk about. So the Warheads to Windmills campaign is about addressing these two existential threats. We don't want to kill two birds with one stone, so we're feeding two birds with one scone. But these two threats are absolutely interlinked in a number of ways, and we can address one by addressing the other, and we have to. We have no choice if we want to survive as a human race. So I want to start by looking at the climate situation. As I'm sure you all know, the US historically has been the major emitter of carbon and other greenhouse gases over the decades, but we're now overtaken by China. So China is a major, the largest carbon emitter, followed by the US, followed by the EU and Europe and India and Russia. So these are the five number one top areas of the world that have to cooperate and work together if we're going to solve the climate crisis. Sorry? And yet these are the exact countries that are pointing nuclear weapons at each other. And there's just absolutely no way that we're going to solve the climate crisis unless we can address the nuclear issue and get these countries on track to work together and build a cooperative way of addressing the climate. Because no matter what the US does to address climate, if we're not doing it with China and Russia in particular, we're still going to be facing a climate catastrophe in a number of years. The costs that it's going to cost money to solve climate, there's no doubt about that. The Inflation Reduction Act has reputedly put in $369 billion, which is a massive amount, way more than has ever been put in before to address climate. But more than half of that, about 2/3 of that, is in the form of tax credits, which may or may not bear fruit. All of that money is to be allocated over the coming decade. So per year, the actual amount of grant and money directly spent by the federal government comes to more like 144 billion over 10 years. So that's more like $14 billion a year, which is still a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to what we need to fully address this crisis. And I'll just mention briefly in this chart, the top blue column there is the Global Green Fund, which is to help poorer countries pay for the transition to green technologies. And although you may have seen President Biden recently put out announced that he was giving $1 billion to this fund, which is great, but we'd already committed many more billions, and the amount that we need to be putting in as the United States, if we want to seriously address climate, is more like 30 billion per year into this global fund. So it's a massive amount compared to what we're currently doing. The same with forests. I mean, there's all this talk about carbon capture, but we know the proven technology for capturing carbon is by planting trees and making sure we have enough trees and wetlands and so on. And although the Biden administration has promised to plant 1 billion trees over the next decade, again, this is a drop in the bucket for what is needed. The campaign globally is to plant 1 trillion trees. That's 1,000 times what the current administration is planning. So we need to put money into this. President Biden did have in his original plan, a reconstruction of the Civilian Conservation Corps, but that was pulled out of the final package, and we need to be hiring thousands or many people to plant many more trees. Same with public transport, same with investing in the electricity grid and so on. Now, this money can come from any number of places, including just restructuring the tax system. But one place it can come from so easily is from the nuclear weapons budget. And again, the amount of money that we're planning to spend on nuclear weapons over the next 10 years is way more than people realize. I've drawn here, this is cumulative, so it's each year added on top of the previous year. But at the moment, as you know, the House just passed Defense Authorization Act yesterday or whatever, a couple of days ago, which calls for about 50 billion to go into the nuclear weapons program out of 800 and something billion. But that's also only part of what we spend on nuclear weapons. As you probably all know, again, the actual nuclear warheads are paid for out of the Department of Energy. And on top of that, there are all these other costs, including costs which no one really takes into account. I mean, these figures are all from the Congressional Budget Office, but you have to dig very, very hard to find them. And I won't go into the figures because we don't have time, but this gives you a sense of the amount of money that we're pouring into nuclear weapons, trillions. I mean, this is just for 10 years, but we have a program for nuclear weapons buildup that goes over the next 30 years and is literally trillions of dollars, which could be going into climate instead. And then we have the issue of jobs, and particularly of high level jobs, scientific, engineering, technical jobs, which currently this shows you some of the nuclear weapons sites where there are civilian jobs. The main nuclear weapons facilities, laboratories, and so on, where they put them together, and then all the private contractors who actually build the parts for our nuclear weapons programs: Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, all these companies. These people are, of course, don't want to lose their jobs, but I mean, when you look at what these people specifically could be doing for addressing the climate, it looks more like this. I mean, it's literally hundreds of times the number of jobs, and in the same places and with the same skills and same training in some cases. I mean, there's been a lot of studies done looking at how the transition could take place between people, making submarines or warheads, and what we need to be addressing the many challenges that still face us in terms not just of new technologies, but how to recycle the materials that we need for the future. How to make them more environmentally friendly, and ensuring that we're not damaging the planet and exploiting child labor and all the rest of it, in order to get the materials we need to make this transition. So the Warheads to Windmills campaign is about using the money the international goodwill, the brain power, and the jobs that are currently going into nuclear weapons and put those into climate. And we have a bill in Congress which asks exactly for that. And we've just been down there lobbying the last few days and talking to members of Congress about that. But as we all know, things are not so simple. I mean, this is a no-brainer to solve threats that threaten the whole of humanity. Why don't we just do it? Well, the answer is that there's money involved, and there's vested interests, and there's a whole system rigged against us that just keeps feeding, the corporations pour money into the media, into the re-election campaigns, into advising members of Congress, and it just goes round and round, and no one seems to be able to get out of it. And so the Warheads to Windmills campaign is very much focused on the companies. And here are some of the culprits. These are the main fossil fuel companies. And you see some numbers there. These are investments that they put in to lobbying and advising members of Congress, millions, and they get billions in return in terms of subsidies, in terms of promises to open up, lands in Alaska and whatever else to keep their businesses going. And we have the exact same situation with nuclear weapons companies. They spend millions and they get in return billions and billions of contracts from the federal government. So this is what we're up against. We know that it's difficult, it's not going to be easy, but at the same time, we also know that if we can put pressure on these companies, we can actually make a difference, and we are making a difference. The fossil fuel movement, divestment movement, has already convinced institutions around the world with over $40 trillion worth of assets to commit to divesting from fossil fuels. And that is already having a huge impact on the fossil fuel industry. They don't want to admit it, but we wouldn't be having the kinds of discussions that we are having in Congress as well as in the media if it weren't for the pressure that's being put on these companies. And we've got to do the same thing with nuclear weapons. And I don't know if you all saw last year that New York City Council voted to divest New York City pension funds from nuclear weapons. They've already divested from fossil fuels, as have a number of other cities around the country. But this is a huge breakthrough. As I said, 40 trillion has been divested, in not divested, but institutions worth 40 trillion have divested from fossil fuels. The figure for nuclear weapons is about 4 trillion, 4.6 trillion, which is much less, but it's still a huge amount of money that's being held back from the nuclear weapons industry and putting pressure on those industries. And that includes two of the largest pension funds in the world, in Norway and in the Netherlands. It includes cities, like I said, New York City, Chicago, Oakland, California. It includes countries that are joining up to the nuclear ban treaty, and some of them, like Ireland, have already committed to divesting in as part of that. So we're trying to put pressure on these companies. You've all heard about stranded assets, where fossil fuel companies have, their value is based on the amount of oil in the ground, and if it looks like that oil is never going to be pumped up because countries are saying we're not going to do that, then their value is severely affected. With the nuclear weapons, the issue is legislative risk. If countries like Ireland say it's illegal for you to invest in a nuclear weapons company or to even have relations with a nuclear weapons company in Ireland, that is a legislative risk. And the biggest of all is the reputational risk, because these companies' value on the stock market is related as much to their reputation and their brand as it is to their value of how much money they're making. And so by shaming these companies, by stigmatizing, by putting pressure on them, we are doing the best we can to make a difference in terms of getting a change. And here's just a sampling of of cities that have divested from fossil fuels in the green, from nuclear weapons in the blue, and from both in orange. And as I think I just mentioned, this is about fossil and fissile divestment campaign. So that's just a very quick taster. We're all believing in peace and human rights and nonviolence and all the rest of it, and we want to see these changes, but it's not just being all peace and love. We want to be a dove with teeth. We want to use our power that we have with divestment, with boycotts, with stigmatization, with international laws and national laws, and build the pressure to get these companies to turn around and get Congress to turn around and save the planet. I mean, that's our only hope. And so we're trying to join forces between peace movements and climate movements. We've got a coalition of organizations. Here are some of the organizations that are currently part of the coalition, and I very much hope that the Coalition for Peace Action will join us. We have Peace Action nationally as part of the coalition, as well as several other peace action groups in Massachusetts, Maine, I'm looking on here, North Carolina, Wisconsin, as well as other groups, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Pax Christi, World Beyond War, Code Pink. We've got a great coalition going, and we're going to use it to as I said, build the movement and build the pressure on these companies and on the members of Congress. And if you want more information, there's a report here, nuclearban.us/W2W, or you can also go to warheadstowindmills.org. I can put that in the chat if I can figure out how to do it. And you can
Thank you.
join the coalition and find out more. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Tim and Wallace. That was wonderful. Please check the chat for the warheadstowindmills.org. You may know, or may or may not know, you're welcoming us to join your coalition. We've actually been using your book, Warheads to Windmills, since 2019 as part of our educational program. So we are actually part of your coalition, whether you know it or not. Okay. We are very proud of the work that you're doing, and people will have many questions after our next great speakers. We are going to turn now to Sophia da Cruz and Okezue Bell. Sophia da Cruz has been with the Coalition for Peace Action only since May, but she has been one of our, I have to say, one of our most effective interns ever. And she's been very active and helpful in bringing people along. Let me tell you a little bit about Okezue Bell. Okezue is a Nigerian-American student and STEM inventor. I don't know if you're 18 yet or whether you're still 17, okay, so you can tell us. But in your short life, you have conducted neuroscience research in genetics, signal processing, and neurology at Harvard Medical School, the MIT Media Lab, and elsewhere, the Boston Children's Hospital. Okezue has created the We Arm, a prosthetic arm for below the elbow amputees that is marketed at under $400. That's a remarkable thing for people who need a prosthetic limb. Currently, Okezue is the founder of Fidutam, a SIM-based microfinancing application for unbanked, low infrastructure communities. But we have invited Okezue here for another reason. He also represented the United Nations Association of the United States of America last year in November at the Sharm el Sheikh COP27 climate conference in Egypt as our youth climate ambassador. I'm saying our because I'm a member of the UN Association of Greater Philadelphia. And in 2023, he's been appointed to be our UNA Youth AI, that is artificial intelligence ambassador. I'm not even sure what that means, but maybe he can tell us. So we're eager to hear what he's learned, what he recommends on the climate issues for the generation. So I'm going to turn it over to Sophia da Cruz for the dialogue with Okezue. Sophia, please.
Yes. Hi, Okezue. We're happy to have you here. I think just to start off, we'd love to hear about your experience at Egypt COP27, the climate conference that Ed was just talking about.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be able to be with all of you and sort of chat a little bit about my experience and work. So I was at the COP27, which is the UN climate conference that happens annually. This year's is in Dubai. It's called COP28, of course. And it was a very interesting and enlightening experience. It was my first COP, so I was very fresh. I was sort of speaking on a variety of different stages, and I came at the week 2. So the week 1 is essentially the conferences are split into 2 weeks. So week 1 is a lot of at least that year there were a lot of politicians coming in. It was a very sort of policy centered conversation that was happening. Many of the headliners and world leaders. And then week 2 had a lot of still A-listers, if you will, though a lot of them come from celebrity, or there were very famous CEOs of large scale organizations, and then a few political leaders as well. In my experience, COP is structured almost like a trade festival where, there's a lot of different pavilions and places to go to. So both visually and intellectually, it can be very overwhelming, which is essentially one critique that I have of the conference as a whole, is that I think that because of its magnitude, a lot of times the conversations that need to happen are stifled or sort of suffocated by the immense number of people that are there, as well as the immense number of different interests and conflicting sort of ideals. There were fossil fuel lobbyists that attended COP. There were glass bottles, but nowhere to throw away anything. There was no trash sort of at the COP conference. So it was sort of very ironically set up and structured. Though at the same time, I think having so many people opened the doors for me to have some amazing conversations with organizations that I work with now, like the American Lung Association or like with Together Band. But overall, I'd say the experience itself was very mixed. There was definitely a lot of sort of posturing there as well. And I think this is something that the climate movement falls prey to quite a bit, is that, activists or individuals who are highly removed from the problem have the luxury of sort of benefiting from it and becoming pedestalized as climate activist celebrities, but there are also various degrees of separation away from the actual problem or whatever solution that they're aiming to build. And so as a result, a lot of the conversations that you can have at COP end up not really going anywhere unless there's a significant amount of money or a huge return involved. And so I think it really just depends on who you're talking to at the conference there. For me, it was pretty much anyone and everyone, though I will say that a lot of the big discussions and the real conversations are relatively hidden or just not very public. Even for a speaker, for example, the deliberations that are happening are not visible to the public, and it's pretty much forgotten that they're even happening, that they're debating policy issues on climate at COP, which is sort of the main reason that the conference is held in the first place. But I think consumer interests have sort of overtaken that. And so it's very rarely even recognized that, there are big policy decisions being made. And instead, COP has sort of become this extremely large attraction that happens every year that is sort of cosplaying as a big climate discussion. So it can be helpful, but it's pretty much up to the individual who's there to make it something useful.
That's really interesting to hear, both the positives that you experienced along with the negatives, because I think that's really important. to also hear these critiques, especially coming from a young person present at these conferences. So were there any themes or ideas that really stuck with you the most that you'll maybe take to the next climate conference that you attend?
Yeah, so one of the big themes that I discovered was that a lot of times this climate issue is actually very intersectional. I think it's a pretty obvious thing, that the climate and environment affects various other aspects of our lives. But when you take time to really understand what ways in which that is true, it can have a lot of effects on existing things that you may be working on that you originally thought were outside of the climate sphere. To give you an example, there's plastic pollution ending up in pregnant women's placentas. Over 50% of asthmatic or of lung cancer cases that are non-asthmatic are as a result of air pollution. There's a variety of other issues, like recently farmers have been having liver and pancreas issues because of the fact that the temperatures are rising pretty significantly, and we're hitting some of the hottest periods that we've ever had in history. And so realizing that this climate issue is very much so a health issue makes you start to wonder sort of what solutions can I be implementing that combat these health problems that are resulting from climate and can be scaled effectively to groups that are disproportionately affected by climate change. For me, it was actually climate finance that stuck out pretty significantly because, as was mentioned, I've been working on Fidutom, which is a public benefit corporation that provides digital identification and microloans to the unbanked. And what I realized was that a large majority of nature practitioners and individuals of Indigenous communities that are probably the best stewards for protecting and administering nature-based solutions are oftentimes some of the most financially siloed across the board, as well as people like farmers or agricultural practitioners. And so by providing them with digital identification and small amounts of capital, helping them mobilize upward will mean that they'll have a larger percentage of the global stock take and will likely be able to contribute more with regards to their solutions by receiving this additional funding. And they'll also be able to have this as a working sort of living method of being able to deploy their solutions and living sustainably, but also financially sustainably as well. So getting them from that pipeline to unbank to bank has actually massive implications on climate as well. If there's no one to tend the soil and launch reforestation efforts or protect coastal ecosystems because they're so financially marginalized, that will have detrimental impacts on our climate. So it's essentially funding these climate warriors, but in a way that initially seemed very indirect. It wasn't a climate project that I was working on, but it actually has huge implications on climate. And as a result of learning that, I've been partnering more with organizations that work directly with farmers and Indigenous communities to hopefully finance more people that are working in nature-based solutions.
Yeah, I think your point about intersectionality is incredibly strong. Just, the way that climate issues impact so many other issues and the way you found your niche within that. And so I'm curious about what your perspective is regarding what is drawing young people today to be involved in issues surrounding climate change.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's almost like a two-pronged thing, and I think it can be good or bad. And so the first reason is I think that climate, compared to a lot of other issues like AI ethics or whatnot, actually has a very low sort of barrier to entry, in the sense that, there's not a super high technical mountain that you have to overcome in order for you to enter into and gain a base level understanding of the issue. Whereas compared to things like AI ethics, you have to understand how the model works, what discrimination looks like, things of that nature. And so because of that, young people are drawn to the problem more discreetly. And it's also has impacts that are very tangible and easy to sort of galvanize action towards. And so I think also the climate movement is a lot less saturated with professional opinions and beliefs. And this might be something relatively controversial and almost negative in this sense, because I think that compared to a lot of other social movements or issues where there's a lot more technical sort of buy-in and weigh-in, the climate movement is sort of governed by individuals from all spaces and belief systems. And as a result, it's not saturated with climate scientists speaking out on the issue and presenting data constantly. It's definitely a lot more accessible. And I think this can be a good and a bad thing because, young people entering into the climate movement is amazing. We're taking over market capital. We're sort of dominating almost all spheres of life, especially as time goes on. And so it's really important that we become climate conscious and inherit the problem in a way that is effective, ensuring that we're living our lives in a way that doesn't continue to propagate or exacerbate these issues. But at the same time, because there's such a low sort of technical literacy barrier, it also encourages this sort of fake it till you make it mentality on the side of some activists. I think activism can be helpful and amazing, but sometimes it's just showering large audiences with huge platitudes about Gen Z and climate, but never actually taking any sort of tangible steps or actions. And that's why I think Greta is a very prototypical and unique example of an activist, someone who was so committed to the cause. Like, she might not have had the technical know-how, but her level of commitment is just starkly very different from most of the activists currently in the climate movement. And I think another sort of step on that is that, activism now is sort of relegated to speaking and talking to large audiences rather than building out solutions or championing existing solutions. And I think this can be something that's also very detrimental because, like I mentioned, a lot of conversations, say at the COP27s or at the New York Climate Weeks, they end up not resulting in any tangible action or change. I know there was a lot of disappointment that was brewing after COP27. And I think that because of the fact that the space is just so saturated with so many different voices, so many people graduating from becoming activists to celebrities and no longer having the bandwidth to actually work in the movement or the space or deploy a solution, means that a lot of times what we need for the climate movement, the technology, the working within on-ground communities, all of that sort of gets lost in the sea of advocacy that's happening. So while I think that it's great that new and fresh perspectives are being injected in the climate movement, I think that we need to be wary on what new perspectives and people are being injected and how connected they are actually to the cause that they're forwarding. Because I know for me, I think my contribution to climate isn't being a young person or a person of color, although those are amazing perspectives to have, and I think they should be reflected across policy decisions, conferences, all sorts of discussions. I think my biggest buy-in is that I'm building something. I'm building out Fidutam. I'm deploying it to real people on ground. And I think not enough people are valuing the importance of developing solutions. So definitely think that we need more young solution builders rather than young activists, which is why I think the work that the UNA USA is doing, what you're doing, is so amazing, really forwarding these types of conversations and fostering an environment where solutions can be built effectively or directly building the solutions yourself. So just very excited to see this happening.
Yeah, your point is really interesting about like this kind of pipeline from activist to celebrity that kind of narrows the definition of activism, so that I think there are many people who don't think of themselves as activists or think I could never be an activist because being an activist means I have to speak in front of a crowd or I have to do this thing that maybe might not be someone's strong suit. So in some ways, the definition of activism then becomes limited, but that is a tangent on itself. So anyways, to continue on, what do you think the next steps are for our generation in order to combat the climate crisis? Where do we go from here, essentially?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is really deploying responsive solutions. I've seen a ton of different sort of methods of climate education or creating content and things of that nature. But I think it's now coming down to us having to really work within communities to build out effective technology. Like, you could create all of the climate documentation in the world, but if it and say, make it more accessible to a broader variety of people. But if people, say, indigenous farmers in Uganda or people from some of the poorest districts in the United States are being adversely affected, they're getting cancers, they're getting new asthmatic shocks, they're developing new diseases as a result of climate, they don't really need the UN's index on climate change for this year. What they need is an effective solution that's actually deployed on ground. So I think what's really important is considering the people who are adversely affected. It's really easy, you know, from my vantage point to say, you know, tons of people aren't educated on climate. All we need to do is just like create more climate content and send it to those communities, and you know, it'll be fine. But those communities can learn about the problem that's adversely affecting them, but it won't stop them from dying from it. And so I think it's really, really important that, you know, with education comes actionable steps to build out solutions. I think we've gotten the education part very solid. There's so much focus on that. There's so many conversations, so much press and spotlight surrounding it, but there's not enough focus on the climate-based solutions. And I think that also ties back to corporate and ESG responsibility to fund these types of opportunities, because I think the reason why we aren't seeing as much of that, especially on the parts of youth, is because there's, of course, a technical literacy barrier, in the sense that, you know, you have to learn all the science and whatnot. But there's also this huge funding barrier where, you know, Google doesn't want to invest $100,000 into a completely new venture, or they might, but these opportunities aren't as accessible at the moment. So I think it's really important that we collaborate with overhead organizations, foundations, to really ensure that our solutions are reaching the people that need it the most, and that we're measuring impact in a way that also is ensuring that we're quantifying how we're reducing human suffering or helping people directly, not just the volume of what we're outputting, but the tangible results of what we're outputting as well. So yeah, just more conversations like these, but also more solution building, and really tying together education with action. I think that's the biggest thing. Both are wholly necessary, and both are highly important, but they need to work in tandem with each other if we want to see actual progress.
Absolutely. And just to your point about education, like you said, you know, there's all these resources going into education, but at the same time, like, everyone feels the effects of climate change in their own communities, so that education can kind of go both ways, and communities themselves have their own perspective in how they're being affected by different climate related issues, and that can be a portion of education as well, rather than teaching, also learning. And with that, we just wanted to say thank you so much for doing this interview. I enjoyed talking to you, and I would love to chat with you again in the future. Thank you for all your perspective and all of the wonderful things you had to say.
Thank you. It's great to talk with you as well.
Thank you, Okezue and Sophia. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. I'm glad you brought up the question of, you know, acting locally. You know, there's this expression that's used in our movement, think globally, act locally, which I'm sure you've heard. And what Okezue has been saying is basically that you have to bring it home. You have to bring home solutions. You have to bring home movements to our own communities. And in this area, we have communities that are in great need. I could name just a few: Chester, Pennsylvania, Camden, New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey. Right here in Philadelphia, there's neighborhoods like Southwest Philadelphia that have several, not one, but several refineries, okay, oil refineries that create asthma problems for the kids in that community. I could go on, you know, pipelines that leak into our communities. We have to stop these things, and that's part of why we have to stop the predominance of fossil fuel over clean energies, which we will get to. So thank you again, Okezue. It was very enlightening. We're going to move on to our next speaker, and Sophia, of course. We're going to move on to Dr. Joseph Gerson, who should be coming up on the screen soon. Joseph Gerson is a very distinguished person, in my view. He's president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He's co-chair of the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy, and that's a very important thing right now. He is co-convener of the International Peace and Planet Network. He's been a longtime leader in the AFSC, that's the American Friends Service Committee, where I met him here in Philadelphia. And he is now in Boston. And I believe you still have a role in AFSC, a major role in AFSC in Boston as well, if I'm not mistaken. I was intrigued in your bio, Joseph, to see that for the past year and a half, I don't know how much you can reveal about this. For the past year and a half, Joseph has been a participant in a, quote, confidential track 2 process with elite national security figures from Europe, Russia, and the United States. I could say a lot more, but again, please look at the complete bios at peacecoalition.org. And now let me just, I'm proud to introduce Dr. Joseph Gerson. Please take it away.
Thank you, Ed. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And I want to thank you and Jennifer for inviting me to today's panel. I should say that with AFSC's priorities changing, I no longer have much association with them. They have their priorities, and I hang in with mine. And I'll be happy to say what I can about the Track 2 process. It's been a little bit like the old Sesame Street routine. Which one of these is not the same? There's me, and then there's everybody else. As I begin, I also just wanted to appreciate Timon's and Okezue's talks on the climate and on the connections. And I really, I've worked with Timon for a long time, and I was really impressed by Okuzue's critiques and his commitments. They're very encouraging. I want to step back to something that Timon briefly referred to in terms of facing twin existential threats to human existence. Those are big words. We go on with our daily lives, but I think we need to appreciate just what that means. That humanity as a whole, its survival, its future, are threatened by both the dangers of nuclear war, which are not abstract, and I'll say a bit more about that along the way, and of the climate crisis, which we are increasingly feeling, and which is only going to get much worse. I have to say, my heart, I'm helping to raise my grandson as well as my kids, and my heart goes out to Sophia and Okazue's generation as you have to struggle with this threat to your futures. I guess the other thing I wanted to say as I begin here, we lost Daniel Ellsberg a couple of weeks ago. Dan devoted his life's energy to peace and to nuclear disarmament. I mean, he faced 115 years in prison for the crime of telling us our history. And I think the reality is that we have to, as Dan did, draw on our life's energy and remain focused on what we can do to preserve humanity, peace, and justice. That said, I'm going to work from a written text, which I'll extemporize on a bit. But I think we need to face the reality that despite the modest thawing of U.S.-Chinese military, economic, and technological and diplomatic tensions, we are threatened by the danger of a catastrophic war, which in turn undermines our ability to cooperate to address the climate emergency. I have to say, I'm glad that the Chinese are finally welcoming John Kerry to renew the discussion, but it's a long ways to go. And just to underline the power of vested interest on all sides here. I was in Mongolia last year and learned that their major export is coal to China. where the Chinese put the coal back into the ground for future use and used the process to influence their power in Mongolia. And we certainly know about corporate corruption here in the United States. We also are, facing the Ukraine war, and following in the tradition of preparing and threatening nuclear war during international crises and wars, which is something our presidents have done on at least 30 occasions. Putin and other Russian leaders have rattled their nuclear sabers. I made reference before to talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear war not being abstract. There was a report from Reuters this last week that a unit related to Prigozhin's march on Moscow took a detour. And where did they go? They went to a nuclear weapons storage facility. And that was the reason that it was a battle that involved the downing of several helicopters. So we need to understand the reality of these threats. The Russian weapons are unlikely to be used in Ukraine unless unexpectedly the Ukrainian forces threaten Russian control of Crimea, which has been functionally Russian since 1853. And discussion about the idea of retaking Crimea is, I think, is just dangerous insanity. But to maintain nuclear pressure, Putin is deploying nuclear weapons to Belarus in order to offset Moscow's deteriorating conventional military capacity. A source of concern, and one which has been discussed in that Track 2 process, is whether those nuclear weapons will be securely held, whether they'll be secure under anyone's control while they're in Belarus. And senior Russian analysts are clear that for years to come, Russia's conventional military inferiority will dictate their increased reliance on their nuclear arsenal. When you come to think about nuclear weapons accidents and miscalculations, that should be sufficiently chilling. Elsewhere, the US, Japan, and their allies are increasing their already massive levels of military spending, sacrificing spending for human needs, including climate resilience, as Tim was talking about. In the US, this includes funding replacement of the entire nuclear arsenal and its triad of delivery systems to back up US nuclear threats for the rest of this century. So we need to understand that in Washington, China, Russia, other countries, they're building their nuclear arsenals, not for the moment, but for the very long term. The US spending is also for missile defenses. And as the wording is very nice, but the reality is that so-called missile defenses can also serve as the shields for first strike nuclear swords. The idea being, and as Dan wrote about in his book, Doomsday Machine, US policy has really never been deterrence, it's been first strike. The idea to deliver a debilitating attack on the other side's nuclear arsenal, and recognizing that some of those weapons may still survive. The idea is to use missile defenses to wipe out, clean up any missiles launched in retaliation. The US is also deploying new B-61-12 nuclear warheads to 6 European nations, and US nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines are returning to South Korea, just as we speak now. They're coming to South Korea. In Northeast Asia, all 6 parties to the region's tensions, which is to say China, Russia, South and North Korea, the US, and Japan, all have first strike doctrines or capacities, including Japan's ostensibly conventional preemptive strike capacity, which is now reinforced with US cruise missiles. Indian Pakistani tensions continue apace, and an exchange of their weapons can certainly lead to global cooling. Physicians for Social Responsibility tells us that could take the lives of up to 2 billion people in over a decade. Not a nice way to die, and something which is not discussed. And of course, we've got French, Israeli, and British nuclear arsenal. So it's not a pretty picture. To move forward, we need to acknowledge that Bush the Lesser and Trump severely undermined the foundations of the world's arms control architecture by withdrawing from the ABM and INF treaties. Moscow has, did I lose my picture here? I'm not seeing it. In any event, Moscow has now put the last nails in the arms control coffin by suspending its participation in the New START and Open Skies treaties, and refusing to be intimidated by the ongoing US and NATO pivots to Asia and the Pacific. China has increased the size of its nuclear arsenal and is preparing to achieve nuclear parity to Washington and Moscow. Simply to say, you know, there are all these holes that they've dug, they've about doubled the size of their nuclear arsenal. And what the Chinese say is that they're building in stages, each time pausing to give the United States and Japan the opportunity to, as they say, end their hostile policies toward China, which of course is a somewhat complicated situation. All this is taking place, I think this is important here, all of this takes place in the context of Biden's national security strategy, which states that, quote, the post-Cold War era is definitely over, and competition is underway between the major powers to shape what comes next. Fiona Hill, who was a senior figure in the National Security Council and a diplomat who advised against NATO expansion, wrote in, I think it was in Foreign Affairs, she said that the Ukraine war, quote, makes the passing of Pax America apparent to everyone. Not everyone is aware of that, however. Many in Washington and the broader public have failed to recognize the reality that we're now in a multipolar world. The belief that America is the indispensable nation still guides US policymakers, fueling self-defeating policies and provocative and dangerous action, like seeking to strategically defeat Russia in Ukraine and sending warships into the Taiwan Strait. I mean, we need to understand just how confrontational the Biden administration is, of course, following on a long tradition. The US is not alone in refusing to adjust to the new multipolar disorder in life-affirming ways. Putin seeks to rule in the tradition of Peter the Great. China aims to establish an East Asian hegemony in the tradition of the Monroe Doctrine, seeking to create security against attack from the East. And the Cold War never ended on the Korean Peninsula. If we are to prevent an Asia-Pacific escalation to nuclear cataclysm, we must address what former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, now the ambassador to the US, named as, quote, the avoidable war. The reality that we need to face is that we're in the midst of what's called the Thucydides trap, the inevitable tensions between rising and declining powers that too often have climaxed in catastrophic wars, twice in the 20th century. But there are common security alternatives to the avoidable war. As Secretary Yellen said last week, even with our differences, the world is big enough for both the US and China. And as both Timon and Okazue have said, you know, this will only change and happen if we push from below. The truth is that in competition with China, Washington is recklessly seeking to reinforce its Asia-Pacific hegemony, which began with its 1898 conquest of the Philippines, Guam, and Samoa, and which was sealed by the defeat of Japan in 1945. It's widely understood that the Pacific basically became an American lake, and the so-called rules-based order, it was dictated by the US following World War II, and countries like China, much of the global South, had no role in articulating those so-called rules, and so we face a bit of a crisis. They have their interests to address as well. I want to show a couple of slides here if I can. Let's see if I can get to it. Here we go. Yeah, so I respect that, you know, not everybody knows their Asia-Pacific geography. So I put this up here to say that, you know, with the dispatches of warships to the Taiwan Strait, with its sorties of nuclear.
Joseph, can you make that any larger at all?
You know, I'm a technological Luddite, so I don't know if I can.
No, that's fine.
I apologize for that. Anyhow, so maybe can you see my arrow? So up here, you know, here's the Taiwan Strait, and we go up here to Korea, where on the one hand we have, you know, we have two countries that have been functionally at war, but with an armistice since 1950. But the United States has on numerous occasions threatened nuclear attack against North Korea, most recently with Trump, but now with increasing military exercises, which include the threat of decapitating North Korea's leadership. And we also have, we have the expanding U.S. military presence really across Asia Pacific, which began with Obama and then pivot to Asia. And we have the Biden administration undermining the One China doctrine. We can talk about that more in Q&A if people are interested. The reality is I've made reference to the rules-based order. Yes, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, China's menacing naval forces in the Philippines and in Vietnamese waters, and with Beijing's rejection of the International Court of Arbitration's South China Sea. Well, let me see if I get to another. I don't want to be seeing this here. Yeah. And with the China rejecting rejecting the International Court of Arbitration's ruling on the sovereignty issues in the South China Sea. People should understand that the South China Sea is one of the world's most vital waterways. About 40% of international commerce moves through it, and most of the oil that fuels the East Asian economies comes across this. So if one country or another has the ability to choke off supplies, they have the ability to bring other countries' economies to a screeching halt. And we have the Seventh Fleet, which has been, since 1945, basically controlling it. And now China, that was interesting. And now China has, with its so-called 9-dash line, claimed sovereignty over basically the entire South China Sea. And you can see it links into territories which are claimed by the Philippines, Malaysia, and other countries. So it's really quite a flashpoint. But we need to keep in mind that these countries are not the only ones to have threatened the so-called rules-based order. We have now AUKUS, the Australia-British-US alliance, which is selling nuclear submarines, both nuclear capable and nuclear powered submarines to Australia, which calls into question their abiding to nuclear non-proliferation treaties. We've got Biden's dispatch of cluster munitions to Ukraine. We have Trump and Bush's assaults on the arms control order, and U.S. invasions from Vietnam, Afghanistan to Iraq. And just to say, I mean, daily we see the horrific destruction being wreaked primarily by Russia on Ukraine, with the daily death toll of Ukrainians, maybe 15, 20 people a day. But those of us who are older will remember the daily death toll from the Vietnam War, which is in the order of 400 or more, 339 as I recall, Vietnamese every day. So we need to understand that history. The rest of the world knows that history, even if we don't. Biden's security strategy gives the China threat pride of place. It's seen as, quote, the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. The U.S. strategy names Chinese military modernization as, quote, the pacing threat that drives U.S. military planning, operations, and spending. Biden's cohort understands that the U.S. can no longer enforce U.S. hegemony unilaterally. Thus, it gives priority to integrating the allies' military, economic, and technological power, and even repressive Modi's Hindu nationalist India in order to contain China. The interesting op-ed in today's Times about just how bad the Indian government is. I think it's about 161st out of 180 countries in terms of press freedom. China, of course, hasn't stood still. It's reputedly doubled the size of its nuclear arsenal and may be aiming for nuclear parity. Its Navy is now larger than the Seventh Fleet and is the leading edge of its efforts to enforce its imperial South China Sea 9-dash line, and it has repeatedly sent its warplanes across the median line of the Taiwan Strait, especially after Pelosi recklessly went to Taiwan, and then McCarthy met with the Taiwanese president in California. And China certainly is advancing in terms of space and cyber weapons challenges to the US. Taiwan is the most dangerous potential flashpoint of this geopolitical stew, except in the case of an unexpected military accident or incident. Beijing, and we need to be aware of this, Beijing has no near-term intention of invading Taiwan, but congressional and bipartisan madness, both parties, is driving dangerous confrontation. And there are other potential triggers for catastrophic regional war. Militarized Japanese competition in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. I mean, these kinds of things happen. Competition for control over the resources of the South China West Philippine Sea. And as you see in this picture, unanticipated accidents or miscalculations that can all too easily escalate into an unthinkable conflict. Turning to my conclusion, and maybe making a reference to those of us, that it's primarily for those of us with gray hair, I agree with Dylan's joker that there must be some way out of here. Let's begin with the building of the TPNW, the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as a transformative bridge to a nuclear weapons-free world. Recognizing that nuclear disarmament won't happen overnight, we need to understand that the treaty is a long-term campaign designed to surround, isolate, and transform the nuclear powers. The treaty's second meeting of states parties will be held in late November at the UN in New York. More governments, possibly including Brazil and Indonesia, will be ratifying the treaty. The meeting at the UN will focus on implementing the action plan adopted last year in Vienna, on progress toward creating a nuclear weapons victims trust fund. And we need to recognize, I'm talking here not only about Japanese survivors of the atom bomb, but we're talking about downwinders here in the United States, downwinders in Kazakhstan, downwinders in China, people from the Marshall Islands, and so on. There will also be a focus on how to deal with treaty skeptics, especially in nuclear umbrella states like Japan and NATO, and a new declaration that rejects nuclear threats and reinforces the nuclear taboo. Representatives of more than 20 organizations, including Timon, have been meeting to plan and coordinate our activities for November, where we will be joined by Hibakusha and other activists from Japan, from Europe, and other nations to press for a halt in the world's nuclear arms races and to move toward nuclear weapons abolition. As we confront the Asia-Pacific situation, we should recall that at the height of the first Cold War in Europe, the Palma Commission's 1982 Common Security Report provided a way forward. It warned that no nation can unilaterally ensure its security, and that security can only be created with and not against the nation's rivals. It was the common security paradigm that served as the foundation for negotiations for the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, which ended the Cold War even before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And common security also provided the foundation, really the architecture for a common security Euro-Atlantic order in the 1990s. The Paris Charter, the Russia-NATO founding document, and an OSCE, a 1999 memorandum. I'll come back to the OSCE as I wrap up here. Adoption of no first use doctrines would be an important step. China does not have a first strike nuclear doctrine, while the United States does. And Chinese analysts tell us that if the US were to adopt a no first use doctrine, which Biden had said he wanted, but then didn't implement, that it could provide the basis for broader and more substantive negotiations between the US and China. Another common security step would be resumption of multi-party talks to diffuse Northeast Asian tensions, to replace the 1953 Armistice Agreement with a peace treaty, and to reduce military forces on the Korean Peninsula, as well as to expand nuclear disarmament discourse to envision a Northeast Asian nuclear weapons-free zone. Other common security steps that can be taken would be negotiation of new multilateral nuclear and high-tech disarmament agreements among the nuclear powers, recognizing at this point U.S.-Russian relations are really approaching what's called the new ice age. But there is discussion, I can say, in the track 2 process of some, if slow progress, negotiations through the P5 structure at the UN, or ultimately through the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I'll just say here, OSCE was the foundation for détente beginning in the 1970s. The structure is still there, although it's little used. In Europe, you do have increasing calls for convening of an OSCE conference in 2025 that could serve as the forum for beginning to put strategic security and common security rules of the road in place. It will only happen if people in our country and other European countries begin calling for it. OSCE is little known here, and I think I just want to call people's attention to it as it's important. I think it's important for us to be encouraging people to develop new paradigms for Chinese-Taiwanese relationships. The one China policy is under threat. In Taiwan, after China seized control of Hong Kong prematurely, there's little respect for the Chinese slogan of one country, two systems. One possible area to explore would be the creation of a confederation, which would guarantee Taiwan's ability to maintain its democratic values, its democratic structure, even Taiwanese military, but in confederation with China as a whole. And I think it's important to be pressing for respect for the International Court of Arbitration's ruling on sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. Yeah. So I think one other thing, I'm just about finished here, to say that of course we must work to end the Ukraine war as justly as possible before it escalates either geographically to a wider European war or technologically to the use of nuclear weapons. It's really critically important. Just over a decade ago, UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon told the international gathering of peace activists that governments will not deliver us peace or disarmament. They can only come, he said, with pressure from below. And that is the challenge to all of us, both in terms of nuclear weapons and in terms of the existential threat of climate change. Thank you very much. Well, let me put up, just so we're going.
Okay.
Here are a couple of web pages and their URLs, and I can
please put those on the chat. Thank you very much. Joseph Gerson. We have time for questions now. We have a number of questions. Please submit the questions to me, Ed Aguilar, on the chat. And we have several already. And so one is for Timon Wallace. Let me get to that. Timon, what is the role of OPEC and the international oligarchy in the climate crisis, and how can its influence be minimized? Let's start with Timon on that one.
As you probably all know, oil production in some countries is nationalized, and we have very little control over it. I mean, we're focusing on the oil companies that are in the U.S., that are publicly traded on the stock markets, that spend money lobbying the U.S. Congress to prevent them from doing what's needed. So that's our focus. You know, there are large oil companies, you know, in the Gulf and so on, that you know, OPEC is a force for sure. But if we really want to change this country's approach and get things moving, you know, we have the money and the resources to fix climate, and it's the oil companies in this country that are stopping us. And so that's our focus. That's the best I can answer in terms of OPEC. It's another whole project.
You're muted, Ed.
Sorry about that. So this question is for Joseph from Reverend Bob Moore. What was the International Court of Justice ruling on China and Taiwan? And tell us more about confederation as a possible pathway to common security. In other words, we have a, one China, two regimes policy at the moment. But what do you think about confederation? How would that work?
First, just to clarify, the arbitration decision was not in relationship to Taiwan, but it was in relationship to China's claims for exclusive sovereignty over about 80% of the South China West Philippine Sea.
Okay.
It's commonly called just the South China Sea, but if you talk to Filipinos, they'll tell you it's a significant portion of it is the West Philippine Sea. But that area also includes like the Spratly Islands, claimed by
Vietnam has
Vietnam.
claims.
And you've had a number of militarized incidents. I mean, as we speak now, there is a large fleet, ostensibly of Coast Guard ships, but actually functionally part of the Chinese Navy, which is occupying waters, basically cutting off Philippine access to the Scarborough Shoal, which fits fully into their exclusive economic zone. Philippines took the question of sovereignty to the International Court of Arbitrations, and they ruled that China's claims had no legal foundation, which means that these other 6 countries have either exclusive or shared sovereignty over these areas. The Chinese government has refused to recognize that. You have a long history now of negotiations for a code of conduct for this area. China has preferred to have one-on-one negotiations, which the power of individual states is relatively reduced as compared to if they were all negotiating together. So this is sort of a continuing wound. The United States has encouraged progress on negotiations of a code of conduct. But on the other side, and one of the other things that's happened here is China has built military bases either on little micro islands or created micro islands by dredging, on which they have these military bases. They claim it's Chinese territory. They claim that they have exclusive economic rights, and they've basically threatened U.S. and other either ships or planes that come in the area. The U.S. in turn has conducted a series of what they call freedom of navigation flights or dispatches by warships, and it's out of this kind of situation that it's too easy to imagine an incident or a miscalculation escalating. In terms of,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
In terms of confederation, I can't claim to be an expert on this, but I was in a webinar a week or two ago with a senior policy figure from the KMT, which is the second major party in Taiwan. Goes back to the original Kuomintang, and its prospects may be looking up in the next round of elections. And basically, what they're saying is that at least some forces within Taiwan have encouraged this. The Chinese have rejected it. But I think it's important, as we can see other options. I mean, other options than the continuing basically confrontation, lack of communication, preparations for catastrophic war, for us to be putting out that suggestion. And I've been in conversations with other scholars here and elsewhere And actually, so one webinar where there was a woman from a GNGO in China. And I suggested, whether is it possible to think of a new paradigm to replace the one China, two systems approach, one that we guarantee is, as I outlined, Taiwanese democracy but also the possibility of reunification. And interestingly, he said, that's really interesting. We should be working on it. So in various discussions, I'm trying to encourage people to come up with creative ideas here.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have a very interesting question from Tina Shelton, who is the leader of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom chapter in Greater Philadelphia. So where do we go for more solution building? It does seem that we are in silos. We could be vegetarians, divest from nuclear, etc. But we don't have a lot of bridges between different ways to make change. I'm going to address that first to Okezue and then to the whole panel. Okezue, what do you think about building bridges between different sectors and people to change?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the main places I go is to a variety of other youth-led organizations or networks. I think a lot of groups are supporting the development of youth-led solutions. I know there are also nonprofits that seek to fund and help MSMEs grow as well, which are micro, small, or medium-sized enterprises. And I think that level or that extent of support is wholly necessary and extremely helpful. I think also one place to go is to have existing corporations and organizations open up the doors for more participation by the general public. I know for Fidutom, what we've done is we've launched our student-led network, which after 2 days of launching, we've had over 400 students join our network. And that's just the students that we were actually able to accept into joining. And so that makes us one of the largest youth-led profitable corporations globally. And so I think more opportunities like that to encourage public participation in scaling or deploying solutions is very helpful, not only to us as individuals, but also to the corporations to multiply and broaden their impact. So yeah, I think threading together a lot of these different fields just requires more conversations that lead to collaboration. And I think the way we do that is through more intentional and actionable steps at conferences and more meaningful conversations. I know I condemned this idea of just talking and sort of having all these platitudes earlier, but I do think that conversations are necessary to achieve steps like collaboration, but it's all about the intent with which we have these conversations. And so I think having these types of intimate discussions is very helpful. I think companies need to be more willing to collaborate and shift their sort of priorities from solely maximizing profit to maximizing profit while also achieving ESG goals, while also being able to interface with other areas in industry. I think Google is a very good example of a multi-sector corporation that is trying to do their part in solving a lot of these problems. They have so much technology at their fingertips, and now they have spin-off corporations. They've built out health applications. They're working in climate. They have Google Cloud Tech for Good. I mean, they've done a great job, but I still think there's a lot more that they need to do in terms of championing the development, especially when it comes to small businesses and organizations, because not every corporation is not going to have $1 million plus in revenue to start out and be able to achieve a partnership with these overheads. So
okay, thank you very much for that, Okezue. I would like to just add quickly to what you've said. There are a number of youth-based organizations that are working on climate, and mostly youth-based. For example, 350philly.org is a group we have worked with, and Some of them may be here today. Another one is the Sunrise Alliance, Sunrise Movement, I'm sorry, and they have chapters in Haverford, Bryn Mawr, in Philadelphia. So there are a number of youth groups. I can put some up on the chat a bit later. Now, there is a question that's come up. Cheryl Spencer says regular attendees cannot write to chat, and the Zoom settings needs to be changed. Well, I've been getting questions on the chat. If you have a question, Cheryl Spencer, please send it to me. I did get your message, or send it to everyone. How's that? Anyone can put a chat message to everyone. Just scroll down on your on the to section and go to everyone in the meeting, and you can put that question out there if you have a question, Cheryl, or anybody else. Now we got an answer from
Ed, can I just jump in? Can I just jump in for a minute about linkages of issues and movements? I mean, I think
yeah, absolutely.
You know, Ralph Ellison in The Invisible Man wrote that all roads lead to the golden day, and we never really know which one of our initiatives is going to break through. But I think we need to. You know, the weapons to windmills is an interesting model, a helpful model, but I think we need to be thinking maybe a bit more deeply in terms of social change here. You know, democracy in this country is under very serious threat. You know, our Constitution, which provides us a lot of safeties, also creates a situation in which we had basically a coup initiated by Justice Powell, in which we've had an extreme right-wing takeover of the Supreme Court, and thus in many ways of our government. We've had, with the most recent decisions, a massive turning back of equal rights, a clear effort underway at this point to turn back the clock, much as what happened with the end of Reconstruction in the 19th century. And I think we need to understand that all of our rights and our ability to move forward is in jeopardy. You know, we need to appreciate that, according to the Constitution, you know, the state of Wyoming, you know, with what, 400,000 people, has the same vote in the Senate as the state of California. And so as a result, you know, the kind of initiatives that we want to break through, both in terms of challenging military spending, challenging the power of corporations over the climate, we need to be finding ways to be pressing both to preserve and to expand our democracy. It's a most serious question at this point.
Well, that is actually something I would agree with 100%. You should know that, for example, we at the Coalition for Peace Action, yes, we work for nuclear disarmament. Yes, we work to combat the climate crisis and potential catastrophe. We also work on voting rights. To me, what you've said, the point of the spear on restoring democracy to this country is to make sure that the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65 is respected and enforced. Unfortunately, we have a Supreme Court that has only partially enforced it. I'm glad to say that in one opinion this year, one of the few good opinions, if I may, of this court, there was an opinion. There was an opinion that said that the map in Alabama was not a fair map on a racial basis. And that is very unusual for this court to say. Unfortunately, right now, good opinions like that from the current Supreme Court are very uncommon. In the meantime, we are coming to the close of our time. I just want to remind you that we have, in terms of interdisciplinary work, I would recommend that you go to the peacecoalition.org website and go to our No Wars, No Warming campaign page, also to the UNA-GP.org website, where you will find our latest newsletter on things we're all doing as a community. Manisha Patel mentioned at the very top of this program that we have a whole alliance that put together this Zoom with 7 different organizations as co-sponsors. So we're proud of that, but we'd like to make that broader and larger. And we commend any of you who are in other organizations or have community groups that would like to work with us. Please do. With that, we are actually past our time. So I want to once again thank Tim and Wallace, Okezue Bell, Sophia de Cruz, and last but not least, Joseph Gerson, for wonderful presentations. And please give them a round of applause if you would. And thanks for coming. We will see you on August 8th. We have our next program in Princeton. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Wonderful, thank you.